Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lisa Henderson, and I'm Dean of the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western, or proud Dean of FIMS at Western, and I'm really delighted you're here for an Asper event attached to our Asper Fellowship. We'll shortly welcome Angela Sterritt and Sara Mai Chitty, but first I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement and then a brief word of introduction. I acknowledge that Western is located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wuk, and Chinongton peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land, original and contemporary stewards of the land, and vital contributors to every aspect of our society. Where the land is stressed right now, and yet it continues to give, and I try to bear that in mind every time I come onto campus. Our official welcome is going to be provided by really important friends of FIMS, who are Dan Smoke and Mary Lou Smoke, who together are hosts of Smoke Signals, the longest running Indigenous independent radio program or media program in Canada. We are so honored at FIMS to have the Smoke Signals archive, which is now under development. Before I turn things over to Dan and Mary Lou, let me say a few things about our guests, Angela Sterritt and Sara Mai Chitty. Angela is an award-winning multimedia journalist, author, and artist, and a member of the Gitxsan Nation. Based in Vancouver, Angela has worked for the CBC since 2004. In 2021, she received a Canadian Screen Award for Best Reporter of the Year for her coverage of an Indigenous man and his then 12-year-old granddaughter who were arrested while trying to open a bank account at BMO. It was a case of profiling that I think was familiar to lots of Indigenous people, but seriously underreported. And so I'm very grateful, and I know a lot of people are grateful to Angela for that reporting. Angela is anticipating the release of her book, Unbroken: My Fight for Survival, Hope, and Justice for Indigenous Women and Girls, in September of 2022. Part memoir and part investigative reporting, the book is a deeply personal look into cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. Angela is also our current Asper Fellow and is teaching a graduate course focused on decolonization, reciprocity, and healing that has students enrolled from a variety of programs at FIMS. Angela joins us in person today after not easy travels from Vancouver, having made the trip for the purposes of this conversation. So we really welcome her, and we welcome her son, Namawan, who we're so glad can join the conversation this afternoon. Angela's interlocutor will be Sara Mai Chitty, who is a storyteller, an educator, and a graduate of our own Masters of Arts in Journalism program from 2015. That program is now Master of Media in Journalism and Communication. A member of the Alderville First Nation, Sara Mai is the Indigenous Curriculum and Pedagogy Advisor in the Office of Indigenous Initiatives here at Western. Prior to that, she was a member of Journalists for Human Rights and spent some time teaching community journalism in two Northern Ontario fly-in Ojibwe communities. Sara Mai has graciously agreed to be a part of this conversation with Angela today, and we're thrilled to welcome her back, as we always are at FIM on this occasion. That said, let me turn it over to Dan and Mary Lou Smoke, and thank you for joining us.
Where I come from, when we greet one another, we say bonjour. So bonjour.
Bonjour.
Asanyanas kwayan dujnakas makwa dodam bachwana bay dunjaba. My spirit name is Shooting Star Woman. I'm Bear Clan and originally come from Bachwana Bay, Ontario, which is on beautiful Lake Superior. And I'm very honored to share some of the teachings that I've learned throughout my lifetime. And most of that time I've spent with this guy here, We're going to celebrate being married 45 years this summer. And we lived together for 5 years before that because that's what the hippies did way back then. Although we weren't really hippies, but we kind of liked to be around them. Anyway, on our second date, we both discovered that we wanted to learn about the teachings of our people. Not just my people, the Anishinaabe, or his people, the Haudenosaunee. We wanted to know a little bit about everything. And our teachers tell us that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. So many elders came into our lives, and we have sat with them, and that's where we gained our knowledge from. So we have a mixed marriage, and we have blended our cultures together, and that's what we're sharing with you today. So we have a little smudge here that we're going to light up, and then we're going to sing a drum song, and then Dan will say a short and condensed version of the Thanksgiving address prayer that the Haudenosaunee people do. And so the song that we're going to sing is a song that I love to sing because I love to teach people, and I love to teach people this song. It's called the Water Song. If you can't remember it from today, it's on YouTube. Key in my name, Mary Lou Smoke, and I'm singing a couple verses on there. So your responsibility, your part of the bargain for me teaching you this song is that you're going to teach a youth, and you're going to tell them about the importance of our water. Okay? So Dan and I get around, let me tell you. So we're going to run into you someplace, and you're going to have to sing a verse for us. So you're going to have to practice to do that. So water is the lifeblood of our mother, the earth, and from the time that we're conceived, we're in water in our mother's belly. That water protects us as we grow and develop, and when it's time for us to be born, we come out into the world, and we need that pure, clean water to survive. When we're in ceremony, the women speak for the water. We always make an offering to the fire, to Mother Earth, and then we take the water around to all the people in the circle, and we all share that water, and we talk about the importance of that water, and the most important thing is that we need this for the next 7 generations yet to come. So it's important that we preserve this water. So this is the water song. Wichita, do ya, do ya, do ya. Wichita, do ya, do ya, hey. Wichita, do ya, do ya, do ya. Wichita, do ya, do ya, hey. Hey ya, Chinaya, hey ya, hey ya. Hey ya, Chinaya, hey ya, hey. Hey ya, Chinaya, hey ya, hey ya. Hey ya, Chinaya. That's pretty easy, right? So let's give it a try. Wichita, do ya, do ya, do ya. Wichita, do ya, do ya, hey. Wichita, do ya, do ya, do ya. Wichita, do ya, do ya, hey. Hey ya, Chinaya, hey ya, hey ya. Hey ya, Chinaya. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, Chinaya, hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, Chinaya, hey ya, hey. Wichita, do ya, do ya, do ya. Wichita, do ya, do ya, hey. Wichita, do ya, do ya, do ya. Wichita, do ya, do ya, hey. Hey ya, Chinaya. Hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, Chinaya, hey ya, hey. Hey ya, Chinaya, hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, Chinaya, hey ya, hey. Now we're going to sing the last verse like our life depends upon water, okay? So just belt it out. Wichita, do ya, do ya, do ya. Wichita, do ya, do ya, hey. Wichita, do ya, do ya, do ya. Wichita, do ya, do ya, hey. Hey ya, Chinaya, hey ya, hey ya. Hey ya, Chinaya, hey ya, hey. Hey ya, Chinaya, hey ya, hey ya. Hey ya, Chinaya, hey ya, hey. Whoa, Machakawas. Wasan. And Matake Wasan is in the Lakota language, and it means all my relations. So we always acknowledge that we're related to one another, and the thing that we need in common is that we need this Mother Earth and we need the water to survive. And so now I'm going to let Dan introduce himself and then say his little prayer.
Okay. Chimigwech Merilu.
Go.
Asanyenas, Indigenous, Kildare, Dodom, Six Nations, Grand River, Dinjaba. So my spirit name is Asanyenas. I'm a member of the Seneca Nation, member of the Kildare clan, and I come from the Six Nations Grand River Territory. So that's on my mother's side. We are a matrilineal society. I'm not sure if the Gitxsan are matrilineal, but we take our lineage through our mothers. So my mother was a Seneca Kildare, and my father was a Cayuga Turtle Clan. So I always try to recognize both of them. Anyways, I'd just like to say Chimigwech Merilu for that beautiful song. The water song is one that always captivates me. I always have good feelings about it, and especially about water, and especially about the women's connection to water, and the teachings that go along with that. I remember we did an interview with Josephine Mandaman. Actually, we did about 2 or 3 with her, and each time she talked to us about how the water talks to us. And we attended this workshop with a Japanese scientist by the name of Dr. Masaru Emoto. You may have heard of him, but he was able to prove scientifically that water has feelings and that you can communicate to the water through your own feelings and your own words that are conveyed to the water. And you can help heal the water. A piece of water or a body of water that's polluted, it can be healed and it will cleanse itself from our own emotive talking to it and communication. So I was really, more and more water is taking on a bigger place in my life as to how important it is. So I just wanted to say that in recognition of the water song, Mary Lou. Niawe, sagwan diso, senio, esquatahas, kit contenwa, guahase, jawise dodaqua, oskada nagohas, oida henahas. I just said a few words of gratitude for this beautiful Wanish Leo, this beautiful day that we've been blessed with to use in a good way. We ask that we bring all of our good intentions and our good feelings and our hearts into this circle here today as we are gathered. And I just want to thank FIMS for doing this and bringing us together like this. And just also want to welcome our sister Angela Sterritt. Sorry, Angela. And I just want to recognize her. I have read her for many years as part of the CBC team. One of the previous speakers that FIMS had here earlier, not too long ago, he talked about the journalist team of Indigenous people, Indigenous journalists who write for CBC, and how happy he was to see that happen. And for me, it's also a dream come true too, where we get to be able to tell our own stories from our own communities because we've learned a little bit about storytelling. And so it's starting to happen because normally we're always getting stories from non-native journalists from places that aren't even in the community, could be from some media office, newsroom in Toronto or in Ottawa or in Vancouver, but it's happening right on the reserve, what's causing news. And it's good that we can have people right from that community telling the news and sharing it with the rest of Canada. So to me, that was always a wish of mine to see happening, and now it's happening. So very happy that CBC has assembled this great team of storytellers of Indigenous descent. So And I also asked for permission to share this Thanksgiving address. These are words that are said before all other words, and we always try to begin our circles with these words. Usually we take great pains to share them at our longhouse ceremonies and our longhouse current different events that we have around the longhouse. And also we are now starting to do them before our ceremonies. For example, a community purification sweat lodge ceremony, a shaking tent ceremony. We're even hearing them before a Sundance ceremony. But you know, it always reminds us where we sit in the circle of life. We all have a role to play in this circle of life, and we follow that, and because we start to find answers to our own life, and so we start to follow those answers and be directed by them and guided by them, because it's always done in a good way. So that's why we share these words. So I just wanted to begin with the water, which Mary Lou sang this beautiful song for. The water is the lifeblood of Mother Earth. It's a feminine, sacred element of life that all creation needs in order to survive. All the life that lives in the water, all the life that lives on the water, is still helping to take care of the water, and the water takes care of all this life as well as the rest of creation. Again, we just want to give greetings and give thanks that this sacred water element, this female water element of life, is still following her sacred instructions. Grandfather, grandmother, so be it in our minds. We also want to acknowledge our Mother Earth, that other feminine sacred element of life that all creation needs in order to survive. All the life lives in her, and all the life that lives on her. The crawlers, the four-legged beings, the two-legged beings, us human beings, plant beings, medicine beings, rocks, minerals, the trees, all the life that lives in the trees, all the life that lives on the trees, for they are all part of an interdependent, interrelated, interconnected life support system that continues to take care of our Mother the Earth, and our Mother Earth continues to take care of us. So we just want to acknowledge that our Mother Earth is still following her sacred instructions. Grandfather, grandmother, so be it in our minds. We also want to acknowledge our Father Sky, who breathes that air, represents the air, and he breathes that air into all creation. So that breath of life that he imparts to us helps all of us to survive. Nothing would survive without our Father Sky, and he's still following his sacred instructions. Grandfather, grandmother, so be it in our minds. We acknowledge also our eldest brother, the sun, represents fire, and our eldest brother, the sun, continues to follow his sacred instructions. He travels from the eastern door to the western door each and every day, and along the way he shows his face to us. And when he shows his face to us, he provides us with heat and he provides us with light. So we want to acknowledge that our eldest brother, the sun, is also still following his sacred instructions, because nothing would survive without our eldest brother, the sun. So be it in our minds. We also want to acknowledge our grandmother Moon. Our grandmother Moon, she looks after all female life, and she also takes care of the water. When she shows her face, every 28 days, she shows her face, and she brings the water from the depths, from the bottom up to the surface, and the water from the surface down to the bottom, and it goes through a filtration process whereby it's being purified. It's like being recycled. So she takes care of the water, and she continues to do that for us. So we want to acknowledge that nothing would survive without our grandmother Moon. And we want to just acknowledge that she also is still following her sacred instructions. So be it in our minds. We also want to acknowledge the star relatives. Our star relatives remind us when it's time for us to conduct our ceremonies of Thanksgiving. Our ceremonies of Thanksgiving are done because the Creator, when we were put here, the Creator told us that whenever we want any form of life to come back and be renewed and repopulate itself, that all we have to do is to give thanks, because that form of life we need for survival. So if all we have to do is give thanks, we started our ceremonies of Thanksgiving. So today, amongst the Longhouse people, the Haudenosaunee, we have 8 major ceremonies that we do throughout the year of Thanksgiving. And many other nations throughout Turtle Island also have their own ceremonies of Thanksgiving. So we are hereby continuing that cycle of helping survival take place in creation by giving thanks for every single form of life. We don't forget anything. Everything is important because it all contributes to this natural world. So we just want to acknowledge, grandfather, grandmother, that the stars, they tell us when it's time for us to conduct our ceremonies of Thanksgiving, or they remind us. And so if we're reminded and we see that it's time for us to do a certain ceremony, then we do it. We just recently completed our maple sap ceremonies, because the maple tree, the wata, or the enatig, is a tree that is the first tree that brings forth the medicine that comes right from Mother Earth to us, that comes in the form of the maple sap. There's 54 different chemical, organic elements of life that we need in order to survive in that medicine. So the maple tree is our principal tree of all the tree nations. We have principal forms of life for each form. And so we always acknowledge the maple tree because it's the first tree that does that. And so we acknowledge that when we, in a ceremonial Longhouse Thanksgiving festival, where we acknowledge the maple sap and the work that it continues to do. Because after a winter where we're basically sedentary, we're not doing too much physically, we need that medicine in order for that medicine to fortify our blood with magnesium, with zinc, with iron, with all these good chemical elements, organic elements, to go out and start to prepare the land for gardening, because my people are farmers, and to go out and prepare the woods and the forests for hunting, because a lot of people are also hunters and gatherers. So we just want to acknowledge, grandfather, grandmother, that nothing would survive without our star relatives, and they are still following their sacred instructions. We also move on to the thunder beings. The thunder beings, if you haven't heard them yet, you will start to hear them, because their job is to wake up the earth, shake it awake, so that the whole world is awakened to be acknowledged that the next cycle of creation is about to begin, and that next cycle of creation has begun. It's always marked by the marker is the maple sap, and when the bears start coming out of hibernation. So that's when the next cycle is about to begin. So that cycle is upon us now. So everything, that's why you're seeing new life around us everywhere you look, four-legged new life. It's beautiful. It's a great time to, I always find that the new life energy that surrounds us in springtime is one of my most favorite times of the year, because it's so sacred for this new life. Because just having been a father and a grandfather, I cherish that. It adds a whole new dimension to my life when I see this new life all around us, surrounding us, and continuing on its cycle of creation. So I also want to acknowledge that the thunders, they're not around during the winter time, because they're giving Mother Earth a break, because Mother Earth has worked hard for us in the last cycle. She provided us with a good hunt. She provided us with a good harvest. So she needs her rest. She needs to get her part of her cycle of creation is to take a time off, and so she sleeps during the winter underneath her sheet of leaves and her blankets of snow. And so we still have snow in some places, and so she's still resting, but she's slowly going to be waking up, and I think the signal has been called upon by the maple sap's arrival for that to happen, because that wouldn't happen without her making it happen. And so we know that once we put it through, that we're giving thanks for all of this, then we know that the cycle of creation has truly begun for the spring solstice, which is upon us now. So just want to acknowledge that we are in the new solstice time of the year, and we just want to acknowledge that this is part of the cycle of creation. We also want to acknowledge the four protectors, which are the four celestial beings that look after all spiritual matters. We all have spirit helpers. We all have angels that help us with our faith and with our spiritual guidance and our belief. And they help us to do that so that we can make good decisions, that we can have a good mind about us at all times. And if we do, then we will make good decisions. We will be better human beings, which we are here to do and perform and to conduct. So we just want to acknowledge that our spirit helpers are still following their sacred instructions. Nothing would survive without these spirit helpers and those four protectors. And lastly, we acknowledge Gitxsan Nation, the creator, the maker of our bodies, because the creator has put everything here for us in order for us to survive. Right here in the Great Lakes watershed, Lisa talked about the dish with one spoon, which basically says, keep it clean, keep the land clean, take only what you need. And she made comments about how it's very critical, the time of our overuse of the natural landscape is happening. So we have to take only which we need so that everyone is taken care of. Everyone is fed. Everyone's looked after. And the last part is to take care of one another. That's the last part of the treaty of dish with one spoon. Look out for one another. Check up on each other. Talk to each other. Communicate. So we know that this is an important treaty for which we continue to live by. Whenever we have a gathering, we always try to bring food so that no one goes hungry. Everyone gets fed. Everyone has a place to sleep. And that's our tradition. It always has been. And we try, as much as we can try today, we try to keep that alive, the spirit of the dish with one spoon alive. So just want to acknowledge grandfather, grandmother, in the spirit of our ancestors. We say, Shimigwech, Nyawe, Sagwan Dizo, who continues to follow her sacred instructions, still continues to take care of us. We just want to acknowledge that nothing would survive without Sagwan Dizo, Gitxsan Nation, helping us along the way, taking care of us, and that's still following those sacred instructions, grandfather, grandmother, so be it in our minds. All my relations, Dane to, hi hi. Yes, Chimigwach,
Ani Bajo, Bindigan, welcome everyone. Wasazon Unquain Indigenous, Nigitxsan Nation, Michasakik Anishinaabe Quain Dao, Alderville, Dushman Zibing in Donjaba, Shaganashin and Aowisam. So hello everyone and welcome. I'm really excited to be here with Angela Sterritt. I just told you all that I'm Otter Clan and that I'm a member of Alderville First Nation. My dad's a white guy, and I said Dushman Zibing in Donjaba because I was born here, and I feel very, very close to this territory, even though my reserve community is 4 hours away. We are in Anishinaabe, Lenape, and Haudenosaunee territory, and I'm very privileged to be able to work here at Western. And to do this in person with Angela, like I'm kind of just like stunned at the moment of like how like crazy this is to be here together, because we haven't seen each other in a really, really long time. The first time that we met was like when I was working with Journalists for Human Rights, and that was like, I want to say like by the time we did that conference that we were like the keynote at, or you were definitely, yeah. That was like 2017 or 2016. I don't know, time is a vacuum. And so even then, like you like blew us all away at the conference, and just like, I just remember Hannah, who worked for Journalists for Human Rights, was like, have you, like, do you know who Angela Sterritt is? And I was like, I've like seen her on like, the news and stuff. And then she was just like, well, she's awesome. You're going to love her. And then like, sure enough, like, yeah, I did, and I do. So to do this together is really amazing. And so welcome to Western, welcome to, this FIMS studio in person.
Yeah.
And so our talk today, the premise of our conversation, I mean, before we kind of like dive into it, that title, Disrupting Colonial Narratives. So I just wanted to like talk a little bit about that, and then I swear you'll hear from Ange, not me. I'm pretty sure the Western community is tired of hearing from me. But that idea of disrupting colonial narratives, so like in my own personal work, I always ask this question, like when it comes to Canadian media, how have these stories told about us as Indigenous peoples, not like by Indigenous peoples, how has that shaped how and what Canadians think and or know about us? And I think journalists have played a very complicit role in the misrepresentation and misunderstanding of the colonial context of Canada and Indigenous people's experiences in Canada, and have a huge responsibility to that, to not only represent communities, but hold power to account. And I'm kind of like left sitting here being like, where is that crux of journalism, is to hold that power to account. And, Hayden King he says it in a really good interview on Unreserved. He talks about how there's this long history of Canada and Canadians, he says, mythologizing the emergence of the country. And there's this narrative that settlers came here and they met Indigenous people and there was a fur trade and treaties were made and everyone got along well. And out of those treaties, Indigenous people agreed to give all the land to Canadians. And then next thing you know, there's this country and all these provinces, and that's that. And that's not the story that Indigenous people know. And the story that Indigenous people know is settlers are coming and they're tricking Indigenous people, negotiating treaties and writing down versions that weren't agreed to. And this has created a sort of architecture of theft whereby Canadians authorize themselves to take up all this land. And so we're here today with someone who has been disrupting that narrative like across so many boards. And so, it's been a minute since I last saw you, Ange, and I know you've been up to a lot of things, and we're going to talk about some of them.
Yeah.
But just tell me what you've been up to or what you're excited to talk about with me today.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I was very excited to listen to Dan and Mary Lou. Oh, and Mary Lou Smoke. Thank you. From my heart, thank you for your words and for your stories. And that's Disrupting Colonial Narratives, is listening to Indigenous people in a lens of not just arriving at the time of contact, but recognizing that we've been here for thousands of years. My elders always say, they like to talk about the glacier period and reincarnation and all of that. So thank you so much for sharing your stories. It's such an honor and a privilege to stand before you and listen to your stories, because that's what matters and that's what we need to be listening to right now at this time and this juncture of disrupting colonial narratives as Indigenous people and Indigenous history and Indigenous languages. And it's so nice to hear your language. And I also just wanted to do a shout out to Lisa Henderson for inviting me to this fellowship, but also one of the big pieces for me in disrupting colonial narratives is having settlers sit at the table with something to bring, not just you go and you do your thing, but I'm going to educate myself and I'm going to bring something to the table so that we can have a conversation where I'm just as educated as you and we're talking, not we're extracting from you as Indigenous people. And so that was, I guess, one of the first times, to be honest, to be very frank, in academia where I've had an academic in that kind of position be like, what about this? And Lisa actually was like, what about decolonization, reciprocity, and healing? And I'm like, wow. And I felt like when she said that, I was like, this is going to be an exciting time to have discussions that can go deeper than just this very 101 conversation, like what happened, what happened in colonization. But let's talk about disrupting colonial narratives in a lens from an Indigenous point of view, not like a very settler, like 101 piece. But okay, so back to your question. That was all of that. I just needed to say that. thank you so much for having me and for meeting us at the table at that place. But yeah, so we met in Northern Ontario. And what I loved about Sara Mai was that everyone was like, we don't know how to serve Northern Indigenous communities. What do we do? And Sara Mai was just like, well, you tell the stories, you go to the communities, you put it on a, what is it, the things that you stick in the computer, I forget what they're called. USB cable, and you do it. And she just had these solutions. And I'm like, yeah, we just do it. Like, why is this so complicated? And I was like, yes, like that is the energy that we need for our own leadership in our communities. So yeah, I mean, since then, I guess kind of fast forward, it feels like so long with the pandemic, first of all, but yeah, writing a book, that's hopefully going to be published in September, and doing this Land Back podcast, and that's been really just so much listening to elders and people about what land back means and how integral that is to reclaiming our identity. And my elders always say, we're not reclaiming nothing. We're not taking back nothing. We're already here. This is already our land. This is already our language. We're just, we're having that not even recognized. My elders would correct me and be like, we don't even need recognition. We just are here, and this is all of ours. So we don't need reclaiming. We're just being who we are. So yeah, I'm just doing a lot of learning and listening. And I love listening to the stories of our elders right now, and that's kind of where I'm at. I'm in a podcast mode, so I'm listening. Yeah, taking up space. That's something I heard a woman say. She was doing this funky move. She was just sitting in her chair doing this, and some guy was like, what are you doing? And she's like, I'm taking up space. I'm just taking up space. And I was like, yes, like we need to be just taking up more space and feeling comfortable about that and bragging around about ourselves more and living, being joyful, all of that stuff. So that's something, a little snippet that I'm sure we'll get into more of, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you said so many good, I'm like, I just want to hear more about this podcast, but I'm sure
we'll get to it. Yeah.
But I mean, to go back to, like the premise, I guess, of you being here, so the Asper Fellowship and working with the students this past semester on the course, Decolonization and the Reciprocity of Healing. And so I was just wondering if you could kind of like just talk about why it was important to you to address that in your class and what the class ended up doing.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was just talking to Lisa about when we were thinking about developing the course was just how important it is. Like I was just saying, like it's important for us to experience joy and to just be able to have the freedom to be ourselves in a society, which is actually incredibly difficult in institutions that have been used to upholding not just power, but colonial violence. So media hasn't just sort of carried those narratives, we've actually perpetuated those harms, and we've actually promoted those harms. And there's many examples of where CBC, for example, did a whole promotional film about residential school and the 60 Scoop, telling people why this is a great institution. So we need to disrupt that. And one of the ways that we can do that is by providing space for our people to heal. And that doesn't mean just, listening, but it means actually actively playing a part in that. So what does it mean when you're engaging in an interview? And traditionally, the media has looked at residential school survivors as somebody they need to hold account. And I've watched that happen, where people have said, like, what do you mean you've been through this? Tell me more. Or just wanting to hear about the harshest pieces of trauma that we've lived for Canadians to really give a crap. And we shouldn't have that. We shouldn't need to tell the grossest, grimmest, harshest of stories for people to care. What does it mean to, before you even begin the interview process, to let people know that you have control as someone who is part of the storytelling process, and that you can stop the interview at any time if it makes you uncomfortable? That is going against a norm where possibly I could get in trouble for suggesting that a participant who I'm telling a story about stop the story and say, I don't want to go forward with this because it's making me uncomfortable. So we spent a lot of time in our class talking about what does it mean to be trauma informed, but then also really learning about how trauma unfolds in our lives as Indigenous people, and that's a space we haven't really been afforded, I don't think, in my personal experience, to explore. Because we've been living in a reality where people have denied the existence of colonial violence and genocide and residential school. And so we haven't even been able to really explore what healing looks like, how trauma unfolds. And so for the students who have all been incredibly brilliant, incredibly scholarly in trying to take this very under-researched area and trying to figure it out and trying to find out basically how to treat people like human beings and how to have compassion and how to have empathy by understanding what does PTSD look like, what does it mean to be triggered in an interview, how can you how can you publish a story without it being just trauma porn and with it being accountable, right? That's what we want to do as journalists. We want to find the truth. We want to hold institutions to account. We want to have impact. And so what does that mean when you're telling stories of people who traditionally we've really done wrong, right? It means that you have to really change the way that you've told those stories, but it also means that you need to conduct yourself in a way where you're disrupting the patterns of relationships that we've had with Indigenous people in the past. Without compassion, without education of understanding the violence and understanding the trauma inflicted on us. So a lot of it was spent creating this trauma-informed manual that will be useful and used for journalists. And I hope that people will learn and learn to do better.
Because it's not just like it's a person's story, but it's also just like, it's a part of like this greater fabric of like what is happening in the world. And if we don't connect it to those contexts, so it's like, you know, if you tell a story about the trauma that someone's faced, especially in terms of like if they are a residential school survivor, and maybe it's like, I'm just thinking of like Sioux Lookout and their like Wanted Wednesdays in their newspaper, the Sioux Lookout newspaper, and it's like literally it's always Indigenous people, and it's always like listing what they've, you know, been arrested for, and it's always like petty crime, and it's like that does not contextualize why those people ended up in those situations. And it's just like how can we, yeah, it's like why don't we contextualize it in this like greater scheme of things. And so like on the question of like healing, I really love that that's what you want to focus on, because like there is so much healing that needs to be done. And so I think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. It called on all of us collectively towards transformative change as justice for like Indian residential school survivors. And, you know, harm and accountability, all of these things, like I've been trying myself to learn like more about transformative justice. And, you know, there's this Bell Hooks quote from her book, All About Love: "Rarely, if ever, any of us are healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion." And so, like, I was originally going to ask you about Canadian media's role in reconciliation, and we just kind of were like, yeah, we don't even want to talk about that word. And so my question, I shifted it to, like, what's that role of Canadian media in accountability to Indigenous peoples and our stories as a part of this healing? And just what your thoughts are around healing.
I think Canadian media has a massive responsibility. And one of the things we talked about in the course a lot was this notion of parachute journalism. And we see that in academia too, like parachute researchers, I guess. And one of the things my students, Kieran Lucas, was talking about is that and this is something I really relate to, is that and that's something we learned in the course too, there's not a lot of data when it comes to things like trauma, like what types of trauma come from residential school, how, free counseling. I was even trying to find out that, because free counseling for me didn't fully come until 2018, I think, or 2017. And there's not a lot, and so I was asking First Nations Health Authority about that, and they're like, oh, we don't have any data. And I'm like, so we have anecdotes, we have a lot of anecdotes. We don't have there's a dearth of data that we need about not who we are, but about some of the ways that colonial violence has affected us. And so one of the ways I was talking about, one of the problems with the way journalism is now is it's this super extractive model. Like, just go get what you need. Like, I remember one time I was told, I was going to the Stalo community and a pipeline was going through this like massive area with all these like artifacts. Like, you could literally see all the artifacts in the ground. It was wild. And so my newsroom said, just pop in, like do the interview in 10 minutes, get B-roll for 10 minutes, and then pop out. Like, and it was like half an hour to 45-minute trip out. And so I was supposed to be there for 30 minutes and then pop back out and file that night. And I was like, absolutely not. I'm not doing that. But I was telling my students, like, when I'm talking about parachute journalism, that's what I've done my whole career. Because you can't live in a community for months at a time. Like, there's no resources for that in media. And what does a newsroom provide resources for? Well, it's for Vancouver or for Toronto or Port Coquitlam. So, you know, oftentimes you'll see a huge discrepancy in the way that different things are covered. So there was a white woman who went missing from Port Coquitlam, which is about 45 minutes away out of Vancouver, and she was missing on a mountaintop, I think, for 3 days. There was like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories. There were satellite trucks. There was just so much resources, and it was like wild. I covered it too. Like, everybody was covering it. Contrast that to a Wet'suwet'en woman who's still missing. That woman was found, by the way, and there was a book written about her in like that week. Contrast that to a Wet'suwet'en woman who's still missing in an area that was near Smithers, I believe. There was, I think, like maybe 10 news articles written about her. I don't know if any media went there at all, but it's the resources that managers decide to put into community. And so when we're talking about the responsibility that journalists have, I mean, for me, I always tell people when they go off on me at Twitter, like, what are you gonna do about this? I'm like, I'm literally at the front lines. You know, we're not well paid as journalists at that level. And we're not making decisions about where our newsroom decides to put resources. And that's a huge piece. And that's something, to be honest, recently my newsroom's been really great at, like, to give me more than a year to work on a podcast where I'm traveling to my home territory, to Wet'suwet'en territory, to Stalo territory, to Nuchotlet. Not just that, but making room for the trauma aspects of it, because that was something I did not anticipate, was myself being traumatized by going home and seeing the land dispossession right, like, in front of my eyes, like, you know, going on and on and on for 100 years. So putting those supports in place for me, that wasn't just like, here's a 1-800 number, but here's an actual support team for you and a process. That is super new in journalism. When you're doing a risk assessment, when you're going into a hostile environment, are you doing a trauma-informed risk assessment? No. You're talking about the vehicles, you're talking about the physical safety of your team, you're talking about getting arrested, all of those things. Do you ever talk about the trauma? No. Or the trauma that you may cause the people in the community by your just being there. So I've really been proud of that shape that this podcast I'm doing has taken, and more of that needs to be done to circumvent this sort of parachuting into communities, extracting, and then just publishing with our name on it and never speaking to the community again. That needs to be something, a resource management thing that's done within the newsroom at a management level. Yeah. That's one of the ways.
Well, it's so tricky too, because, you know, we talk about there needs to be more Indigenous voices in media, and like what you just explained, like it can be really traumatizing to cover your community and what communities are experiencing. Even like if it's not your community, it's still like there is this relation, like it still feels like it is your community. And so these resources that you're talking about, and just like how, like, I keep thinking about this, it's not about being included, it's about building it for. And so just thinking about like an Indigenous person in the newsroom, how, like, are people building it for Indigenous people? Are you experiencing that?
No, God, no. I mean, people are not running to journalism, for one. Indigenous people are not running towards journalism, for one. You know, you could be you could be doing an incredible film where you're being able to, put your opinion in it, where you're able to fight for your people, where you're able to go, yeah, this film is to hopefully make change. In many newsrooms across Canada, look at them. How many Black people do they have? How many Indigenous people do they have? How many white people do they have? There's a survey taken, and I think newsrooms across Canada were generally 70 to 85% white people. And so when you have, quote unquote, diversity hires coming in, what does that mean to exploring how that shift is going to affect people who you want to come into the newsroom, right? So yeah, racism immediately is a big one. So yeah, I've heard that all the time, like, oh, I might get replaced by a diversity hire. That is up to the organization to talk about racism and talk about colonization and talk about how, what is it called, hiring for like or something like that. I heard that in academia, hiring for no or something, just like, oh yeah, we went to the same school, we eat the same food, we hang out at the same bar, and just hiring for what you know, and moving out of that, being uncomfortable, and not just hiring people who tick the box, who, I've heard people say, I've got my card, but people who are confronting racism, people who might have to go to 3 funerals a month and have to take time off work, people who might be traumatized by going on a trip to their home territory. What does that mean to have people who are not what you're used to in the newsroom, right? It means making space, and how are you doing that? And it's massive, because you don't just have, you might have a leader who's really passionate about making that happen, but then you have, everybody else who's, well, why do we need to fix anything? Why would we want to disrupt the colonial norms when this has worked for us for so long? It's really challenging. I don't think it's necessarily unsafe. And to be honest, in many ways, it's safer to work from home because you don't face the same microaggressions every day. People going, hey, Ange, let's go have a powwow, or, I don't like your medicine bag, or I don't understand you, or sitting on the edge of your desk telling you that you just got an award because you're Indigenous. But it does come from the top levels, I believe, to decide we won't accept racism here. If you're going to be racist, you can leave. Not like if you're going to be Indigenous and bring your culture and bring your full self to work, you can go. So what messages are we telling our newsrooms about what it means to be an Indigenous person in your newsroom, or a Black person in your newsroom? What does that look like? What does it mean? And it means changing a lot, but it means not accepting the norms, disrupting the norms. And that's the way to do it, is by saying racism is not acceptable here.
Yeah, I mean, it really goes for like any institution. It kind of just always seems to fall on the Indigenous people or the Black people that are there to always point out the racism, or point out how the environment isn't conducive to like nurture the creativity and like the amazingness that these people have to bring to these institutions, right? And it kind of ties into like another question I had about Canadian journalism and the TRC calls to action, because I think a lot of people, if they're not outrightly named in the TRC, or like a lot of the TRC calls to action are at government levels, right? But what I really try to encourage people is like, yeah, that's a government call to action, but like why do you need the government to like start on that? Like what can you start at right away? And so like, we're here sitting at FIMS in the J School, and like I would like to think that my colleagues are doing their best to do call to action number 86, which is make sure that UNDRIP's in journalism schools, make sure that TRC is in journalism schools. But there's a lot of journalists in newsrooms that haven't been to school in a really long time.
Yeah.
So like, what does that approach look like in journalism? How can newsrooms sort of address this gap in knowledge so that they are bringing something to the table when they're working with you?
I think it goes back to providing resources. So just the same as my newsroom right now is providing resources like more time and more more time. Like we need more time. We need more time to go to communities. We need more time to build relationships. We need more time to be trauma informed. But we also need time for settlers to educate themselves. A lot of times, I'll see like really keen young white people being like, I really want to just get all these like Indigenous names right, and asking for the time, and people being like, oh yeah, just do that like on your own time, like on the weekend. I mean, not saying those exact words, but that's the premise, right? Is that we don't have time for this. And so where does that leave people who are really keen, who want to create, a document where Indigenous people can like click on it and learn the right names from elders, not just Googling, a university and going, this is the way you say it, and then fighting with Indigenous people about the way that they say it, but actually having a document where we can be respectful and know. So yeah, I think a lot of that comes from the top, and I think we can't, you can do education on your own, you can do a lot of things on your own if that's what your focus is, right? So my focus is on Indigenous issues. So I have like time and space to focus on doing investigative journalism about Indigenous people. So does, say, someone who's really focused on marine biology or killer whales or something, but a lot of that has gone to the wayside now, the way journals like the 24-hour news cycle, which has been around forever now, but just this like focus of like constantly getting stories out, content. Nobody really has time to be on beats anymore, right? Or go for coffee with a marine biologist to learn about whales or whatever. So there needs to be time provided. We have time to go through, anti-bullying stuff. There's like a online course for racism, but it's not enough, to like click through as you're watching a movie or whatever, or let something play out on a video, that's considered training. No, that's not enough. You need to give people time to do their own research, to learn about what the Indian Act is. The journalists, even my students, like just now my son, he's 11, he's going to be going into high school where it's mandatory to learn about, we're 2022, and we're just now being told that there's mandatory classes for Indigenous people. So what does that mean for a newsroom when they have like nothing? They need to be either doing the research themselves or given the time and resources to learn. Yeah.
I know. I'm like a little disappointed because during the pandemic, it was like, there was so much rhetoric around like, we need to slow down. And I'm feeling still that there is not the time being taken, the time to build relationships, the time to unlearn, and that it's a long process, a lifelong process. And I'm wondering, I'm like, can we bring that back? Everybody just slow down, just chill,
I know, yeah, it's almost like we're back to normal now.
Yeah.
Back to normal. Ugh.
Totally. And so then that brings us kind of back to, so when it comes to like healing and it comes to telling Indigenous stories, and sort of, like taking care of them. What does that like mean? What are the responsibilities of storytellers, non-Indigenous, Indigenous, to take care of Indigenous stories?
Well, I think it means that we care. And I think that people have shown that there's not a lot of care when it comes to not just Indigenous people, but Indigenous stories. I showed a film today for the last day of my class called Real Injun, just talking about all the stereotypes. And I was making a joke the other day. I was like, imagine how many times I get questioned about like racism, like, oh, there's if you're gonna say racism in a story, like you need to really prove that. Like there needs to be 12 witnesses who are not Black to show that these Black people were discriminated against. Like it is really like that. It's like the burden of proof to prove racism is ridiculous. What if the same burden of proof existed for proving an Indigenous stereotype that we see laden in mainstream stories every single day? What if editors and producers and journalists were to go, wait a second, what exactly am I saying about Indigenous people in this story? There's still this notion that we're primitive beings that can't create a housing development, that can't be a lawyer, that can't, people are always telling me, I don't see Indigenous people anywhere. And it's like, well, we're not, in tunics picking clams or in buckskin riding horses. Like, we look like you and I, like we're lawyers, we're doctors, we're mechanics, we're elders, we're part of this society, and that doesn't mean that we're any less Indigenous because we're not the romantic stereotype that you want us to be. And so what does it mean to care about Indigenous stories? It means having the empathy and the compassion with Indigenous people in our stories, but it also means calling out racism, calling out stereotypes, and taking the time to get it right. One of my colleagues just wrote it's not published yet, but it's a 7,000-word article about Indigenous identity. And he takes like this huge section to talk about the Indian Act. And I'm kind of like, I wonder, like, how do I feel about this? And I was like sharing that with my partner, and it was like, well, we need that right now. Like, we're in a place where we have to kind of spoon feed people. People don't know what the Indian Act is. People don't know what the 60 scoop is. People don't know what the millennial scoop is. So we kind of have to take that time in our stories as well, going back to more time, more space. We can't just have a 300-word story about a complex story that involves colonial violence and trauma and land development. It needs to be longer. We have to give that space to Indigenous stories. And I feel like there is, like, that's happening a little bit by little bit, but it's taken a long time, and it's taken a lot of fight, and it's taken a lot of energy, and it's taken a lot of wind out of people's sails, and a lot of people have left journalism because they want to do like a Finding Cleo with CBC, but Connie Walker leaving to do that permanently with Spotify and do incredible investigative journalism where she has all the time and space in the world, and it's not a constant fight to be able to get that time. I mean, I work for a public broadcaster. Obviously, it's not some big fancy private company, but yeah, we need people to be breaking down those stereotypes. And as much as I would love to say Indigenous people must be telling those stories, I would love to see that. We just don't have the people in our newsrooms. We need people, non-Indigenous people, to get up to speed and to be able to tell the truth, just like they do in every other story. Just in the same way, in the same rigor, in the same investigation that they do any other story, they need to do justice to those Indigenous stories as well.
And they need that context. Like, there's so much, like, even covering like 1492 land back lane stuff, like that is literally over 100 years of like over 150 years of history that isn't being addressed in like an article about the Haldeman land track. And I've kind of thought about this, and I was like, I feel like people need to use hyperlinks more. Like, there needs to be some dedicated people that kind of create these contextual articles, and then they just get hyperlinked. Like, come on, it's the internet. We got to be able to like, connect these things, right? Yeah. And so it's just like, yeah, you're right. Like, that time needs to be taken, and that things need to be contextualized. And like, in the work that we do here at Western, I'm point blank, I operate like from colonialism exists, it's a thing, it's ongoing. Racism exists, it's a thing, ongoing. We're not starting there. That is a given, that is the default. And Newsrooms gotta get on board with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Recently, there was an update in the case that you, or the news story that you broke in 2020 and received an award for. I heard Lisa reminded me, award-winning journalist Angela Sterritt. And so this story of Maxwell Johnson and his granddaughter. And for context, if people aren't familiar with it, they were arrested at a bank in Montreal in downtown Vancouver for trying to open a bank account, deposit money, and this essentially just boiled down to the teller was racist and didn't believe that Maxwell and his granddaughter. And now, since the update is the police officers who arrested them have been suspended for misconduct. And I wanted to bring this up because, like, I use your coverage of this when I teach. Like, it always stood out in my mind because you were invited to that washing away ceremony in Bella Bella, and because you bore witness to the pain and trauma that Maxwell and his granddaughter, and by proxy the nation, and even yourself experienced. And the Gitxsan Nation not only wanted you, but needed you to participate in that ceremony because of protocol, and because they wanted to honor your role in the process of seeking justice for Maxwell and his granddaughter. And this stood out to me because I draw a lot of inspiration from Joanne Archibald, who's a solo scholar. She writes Indigenous story work, and she talks about storytellers, how they are a part of the story. And I don't feel like legacy media or mainstream, because of bias and objectivity, that often journalists aren't considered part of the story, but they are. The storyteller is part of the story, because they have those relationships with people in the story and a responsibility to take care of that story. Like, people are trusting you with their story to do right by it, right? And we talk about journalists, and they need to be biased or unbiased and objective. And so I know, as a Gitxsan woman, you are constantly facing criticism for being biased and unobjective when it comes to Indigenous stories. And this is like a two-parter question. So we'll start with question number one. So, because how do you navigate telling our truths in a world that has denied our stories, denied our perspectives, constantly invalidates our existence? And I can't not ask that question without acknowledging light skin privilege, that we both carry in navigating these institutions. But also more, my question is, what advice do you have, not to other Indigenous journalists, but non-Indigenous editors, news directors, publishers, and anyone in a position of power at a legacy media organization to support Indigenous and other marginalized journalists? Because you are now dancing this world of you have to honor who you are, but then it's like journalism, you can't accept gifts and you can't participate, and it's like a clash of these two worlds. And so you did touch on the support that is needed in newsrooms, but I'm just hoping that you can maybe just really take someone to task here.
And for people who don't know, I wasn't even allowed to tell Indigenous stories for a while. People would be like, well, that's, even my own column called Reconcile This, which I haven't done for a while because I've been in podcast production, but it still exists. But people were uncomfortable with that because they're like, here's an Indigenous woman telling Indigenous stories, and really not understanding how different Gitxsan Nation, a Gitxsan woman living in the city, is from an Inuk man living off his land. Really not understanding that. And people also being like, hey, Ange, do you know this Inuktitut word? And I'm like, how would I just know that? We just know everything about Indigenous people across Canada by osmosis, just by being Indigenous, just ridiculous. And then, at the same time, having white reporters cover all white City Hall all the time, or being buddy-buddy with RCMP officers, and that's considered a plus. Oh, you got a buddy in the RCMP, right? Why don't you get in there? And my knowledge, my expertise isn't considered that. It's considered a biases. Do you know what I mean? So there's quite a discrepancy in terms of who is called bias and who isn't. And that's something BIPOC people have been fighting for, especially since there's sort of been this reckoning in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, and people started to say, hey, maybe we're not covering this properly, maybe we're not covering this accurately, maybe we do have a problem inside the media. I think there's a lot of changes that are happening within media, but not enough, and it's not fast enough, and in many ways, I think there were all this internal reflection, and people, leaders going to meetings and saying, we're doing this and we're doing this, and these are our goalposts and making our newsrooms more diverse. But what does that actually mean on the ground? How are you actually supporting those employees, and how are you making it safe? And there's one thing about including, I guess, your thoughts and opinions in, say, a podcast. There's another thing about telling a story about an Indigenous community that's thousands of miles away and being considered biased rather than an expert. And I think there's more acknowledgement of that, but when you do have an institution that is very colonial in nature, it's really hard for them to see anything that's not colonial as the base, right? Being buddy-buddy with an officer, being buddy-buddy with government officials as being a plus. It's hard to see anything that's not sort of, upholding that status quo or upholding colonial violence as not suspicious, right? Like I think I'm constantly, as an Indigenous woman who's outspoken and who's front-facing Indigenous and who's constantly talking about it, not to be seen as constantly suspicious and she's up to no good and she's making us look bad, rather than here's a woman who's really trying hard to make room for the next generation of Indigenous journalists. And I just think we need, when we're talking about being trauma-informed, when we're talking about self-care, we need to talk about saying no, again, back to saying no to racism, or no to people being, like, why isn't being racist considered bias, right? Why isn't upholding those norms being biased? So, yeah, I think it's just a long journey, and there are some shifts, but I think institutions need to be a little bit uncomfortable with people saying, you're not safe for me, you're not safe for the next generation of Indigenous journalists, you haven't been a safe place. What does that mean when somebody tells you that? Angela Sterritt, Sara Mai, you're not a safe place. That sucks. That hurts. That makes me feel really crappy as an individual. It makes me really uncomfortable. It makes me defensive. It makes me pissed off. It makes me angry. It makes me saying, I'm none of that. But you have to. If somebody's telling you that, you have to say, yeah, you're right, and what does that take? It takes a lot of bravery, it takes a lot of self-reflection, it takes a lot of admitting wrongs. That's not easy for anybody, no matter how amazing you are. And that's what we need right now. We need to shake ourselves off of this false sense of pride that we have and wake up to the reality that we're not doing the best, right? And we need to be uncomfortable with that, no matter how difficult it is, to create change so that we can have actually diverse newsrooms, not just window dressing and not just a whitewashed workforce, right? You can go into a newsroom and be beloved by ticking that box, but be hated for being everything that comes with being an Indigenous person. That's not, easy for the newsroom.
Yeah, and I liked something that you said previously, when we were talking about doing this talk, about how it's like, why isn't dismantling white supremacy considered self-care? And I really loved that, because it's like how can instead of people being like, oh, we want to bring Indigenous knowledges in and we want to bring Indigenous stories in, but what are you doing to protect those stories and protect those knowledges from the very things that have made them marginalized and made them not a part of the very fabric of how the newsroom is run, in respectful, reciprocal ways where it's under recognizing stories as gifts and that they have a power to transform. And it's not about what's happening, it's how it's happening, why it's happening. And I feel like we do lose that, and it gets overwhelming because you just see all these news stories. It's like, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, and we're not seeing the solutions. We're not even seeing people being interviewed who have the solutions. And,
yeah, and I think another problem too is just the sheer amount of emails that I get from people desperate, like they haven't seen justice and they're fighting just to have their child in their care, heartbreaking stories. And, I can do my best to cover those and to, forward them on to people. But for the most part, when I'm not there, there's a lot of stories that aren't getting, and I'm not saying I'm the hero who's going to do that, but it just really sucks to feel that level of pressure. I have to tell all these heartbreaking, horrible, mind-shattering, soul-crushing stories, and that we're forced to kind of do that as Indigenous people because we care about our communities and we want to see change and we want to help, we want to heal. But Indigenous people need to have the same bravery in going, this is really complicated, this is not a simple story, this is not just about injustice, this is also about trauma, and pick that up. But also have the newsroom, that's constantly another thing I hear, is I just don't have the time, I'm sorry, I don't have 2 weeks to cover this. So yeah, it's a long road.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was just thinking about something that I hear a lot is, is like people are afraid of getting it wrong, of doing it wrong. And I was just wondering if you could speak to what happens when you do get it wrong, maybe, or what to do to get over that.
Yeah, no, I've made a lot of mistakes. That's how I've learned things. Like a lot of the errors that I made have been rushing people. I remember a woman drove from, I think, Tahltan territory. I think she might have been on her way somewhere, but she went out of her way to stop in Yukon to do an interview with me about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And it was kind of like complicated because it was what's called a blind double-ender. So she couldn't see me, I couldn't see her, I could just hear her. I could hear her in the mic, and then I could hear our sound guy, and our sound guy wasn't being very respectful with her either. And then I was just like, we really need to get this going. Like I was just pushing, it was awful. I was being an awful person. Like I need to get my story, like get in and get out kind of thing. I mean, that's not exactly how I was, but that's probably how she felt. And that relationship took a long time to repair. I don't know when she did another CBC story after that. And I felt horrible, but I was like, I will never rush somebody again. If this is getting too close to my slot or to my deadline, then, you know, we need to do something else. And a lot of the lessons that I've learned are things that happen outside of what seems like the big moment for you as a journalist. So the interview seems like the most important part, and it really is. You're having a conversation. That's where you're collecting and gathering for the story. But you know, making sure people have a support person is something I've learned. Like bring a sister, bring a cousin, bring a mom, bring a grandpa, bring your daughter. That's so important when you're telling a traumatic story. The follow-up afterwards is something that I've learned from Lorelei Williams. Like, yeah, you guys just do the story and then I never hear from you again. And what about how I'm doing when I have like, you know, hundreds of people online stalking and harassing me, or like dozens of reporters after me trying to get that same story? You know, checking in, making sure they're okay. And I do that like that's a huge part of my practice now. And it's really hard. And sometimes I'm like, what do I do if they are completely broken? Well, you can't put somebody back together. Mm-hmm. You can't unbreak somebody. You can't fix somebody, but you can be there for them and you can let them know that you're there and you can do what you can to mitigate the harm. But we're not trained psychologists, we're not counselors, but we can care, we can have the empathy, and we can conduct ourselves in a way that's respectful. One of the things when you were talking about gift stories are a gift, I remember being in Winnipeg in a newsroom and all these white people joking around, like literally a huge group of people, and there was Indigenous reporters in the newsroom too, and them joking around saying, this elder wants tobacco, what is he gonna do, smoke it afterwards? And I just remember feeling so broken and so hurt and so confused and so powerless. And you know, when you're talking about stories are a gift, or what does it mean to have reciprocity? Well, when, you know, I've respected that despite what the newsroom thinks about me doing that, and, you know, exchange tobacco and people saying, I trust you to tell my truth. And I say, I trust you to tell me the truth. It's a spiritual exchange. But a lot of non-Indigenous people that I know they just don't have that sense of what it means to be an Indigenous person, which for me has been very spiritual. That's like the crux, that's the foundation of who I am, is our ancestors, and thinking about the next generation, those little spirits who are coming to be. And so that gift is something so much more than, you know, a stereotype or, you know, a bribe or something, right? So it's butting up against entire worldviews oftentimes. And a lot of times that can be really traumatizing for me, to have somebody go, well, I'm atheist or whatever, and that's totally fine, but to have someone disrespect your culture completely under, you know, the guise of not being religious or being atheist, or yeah, it's a lot of gritting your teeth, a lot of taking a deep breath, a lot of going, holy crap, like how can people know so little about Indigenous people? And I don't know, some of that stuff, the worldview stuff, is just really challenging, right? Because there's things that you just can't explain to people who are refusing to learn, but also who are looking at you, I guess, like a trope or a stereotype.
Yeah, and I think that kind of all circles back to, like, I really do believe that Canadian media has played a huge role in perpetuating those beliefs, and that there's so much work to do around that. That's the repairing the harm, is to do right by these stories and to do right by like truly like this is an educational opportunity, I guess. Like, how can Canadian media teach Canadians they got it wrong this whole time, and how to do, and how it needs to be done going forward. And so before I check the questions, which is why I have this fancy iPad in my hand, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to mention anything else that you had on your mind about this topic, or any other messages that you wanted to get out there. And
yeah, I mean, the biggest thing for me is I wanted to give my students a shout out. So I'm not going to remember everyone's last name. I'm so sorry. I'm not a names person, but Hadi, Kieran, Veronica, Martha, Michelle. Like I said, like I've taught at a number of schools all across Canada. I'm not just saying this to get like points, right? I'm really not. But this has been one of the best experiences academically of my life, where I really felt like I wasn't just here as like a token, or like we want an Indigenous whatever. It was like we really respect and honor your voice, and we want to have a reciprocal relationship and learn. And it kind of gave me hope in academia. Like, this is real scholarship. Like, I'm learning.
I'm like tearing up over here, because I'm like, it means like, I'm like, I put your name down, and I'm like, yes. Like, I'm just like, so I'm like, we didn't bring you here. Yay. And you didn't have a terrible experience.
No, and my students were freaking brilliant. Like, I feel like at the beginning of the class, I was kind of like, oh crap, it is gonna have to be a 101 thing. And Lisa and I talked about that. It's probably gonna have to be 101, because people in even their 20s are just learning about Indigenous stuff in school and whatnot. And so the way that they transformed, like, there was a lot of them who were really struggling and were just like completely getting it wrong. And by the end, I was like, whoa, like, this is incredible. Like, this is publishable material that will be published, and just so proud. And I never had, I mean, obviously all the students I've taught are incredible, but I really felt like that connection and hope for an institution. And and just, I don't know, some of the people I met too, Sally and Sophia, I was just like, oh my God, you're teaching a course about whiteness? Like, how the hell is this happening? This is amazing. Like, just so excited for education, which sounds so dumb and nerdy, but I'm not that person. I've always been like, I hate academia. It's so awful. It's so terrible. It's so toxic. But just feeling like this is amazing. This is relationship building. This is turning the tides. This is, having people teaching who are not from the super academic point of view. And that's something my students loved, was my personal perspective and my personal experience. And so, I just wanted to say that. Like, I honestly have had like an incredible experience here, even though a lot of it's been online. But every time, this is my second time here, but the first time I'm like, oh my God, now I get it. Now I get why in-person is so important right now in the pandemic. But I just wanted to thank everybody for, like, everyone for having this amazing community here, because it's awesome. It's great. Yeah, and I mean that from my heart.
Oh, that makes me really happy, because I would have been really sad if you had a bad time. I would have felt responsible. So a couple questions have come through. So, like, folks that are listening and watching, like, please put your questions through. I really like this one. I mean, I'm just asking it gratuitously. Do you think that schools like Western should give some land back?
Oh, well, that's where I can't give my opinion, because I'm doing a podcast about that right now. Sometimes I'm like, thank God I'm a journalist. I mean, I don't think it's my place, because I'm not from this territory. But seriously, I think, like, people... The one thing I've learned about from my podcast is that there's actually very differing opinions about what land back actually means. Like, one of my elders, Dimdigibu, Ardith Wilson, says is it's not land back, it's get back. Give us our space. That's what she says. Give us our space to be on our land, to be ourselves on our land. Get back. That's what she says. And other people want it to be more like we need to have more of a relationship with settlers so that we can protect the land together. And other people are like, you know, yeah, just full on give us this back so we can do whatever the heck we want with it. So it's, and that's the beauty of being a journalist, is hearing multiple perspectives from multiple different views and always learning something from those different views. Like that is what I love about coming to a story without like a confirmation bias, without some sort of like, you know, I might go into it being like, oh, this is what it means, and come out and be like, oh my God, that's totally not what it means at all. But I think my perspective on this land really doesn't matter. It is the people of this land to decide what should be done with this territory.
Totally agree with that. And also, I just think it'd be worthwhile for any institution located on any land to really look back and see how they got that land and why they're here and what that actually looks like. And I'm also maybe not saying my opinion.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Well, we have someone who just said, so incredible to hear you speak. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to be a part of a conversation and to be part of a bigger one. So there's that
nice.
one.
Thank you.
And that's from Asma. And then I have another question here. So how can colonial research methods be adjusted to better understand generational trauma? And then they're saying, because aren't research methods rooted in colonial methodology? And I know you're not a scholar, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think methodologies need to be indigenized as well. I was going to say something that someone's like, don't tell anybody that. So now I can't, because it's in the vaults. But yeah, I mean, I think the methodologies need to be indigenized, right? And I think people need to come from a place of free, prior, and informed consent. What does that look like? And whose lens are you coming at it from? You know, in my community, we had so many anthropologists coming through, and there's so much written about Indigenous people, like everywhere across the world, from this like anthropological point of view. Even like our identities, like we're the Tsimshianic people of this, and it's like, no, we're not broken down in that way. I think people need to, I mean, in some ways it's kind of like what my elder said, get back, like stay out, like, but in other ways I'm like, there's this dearth of data, and so people need to do that, but then people also, I don't know. That's a really hard one for me because I'm not an academic, but.
Well, I was gonna say too, is like my big thing is like, it doesn't even matter whether you're a scholar or academic. No disrespect to fellow Indigenous folks who have worked really hard to get their PhDs, but I feel like that's part of the problem, is this thinking that only scholars, only academically trained people can do research. And like, don't get me wrong, there needs to be, like, you can do a lot of damage with research, so you can't just like, you know, go into it. But like, you know, I had a friend recently who was like, I'm not a researcher, and I'm like, but you are, like, you know, and like, just we're like exploring how Indigenous research is like land-based, and that like we do know how to do research. It just doesn't look like the way that these methods that this person is referring to. And yeah, I'm gonna like hold that question for like the future. So we have another question from Alessia. How can, like she puts the asterisks around it, you push newsrooms and editors to provide more funding or time for stories? Is there an example of how you did so? Like, how did you word things? How did you make yourself seem not pushy, for lack of a better term, because it is a delicate situation?
I mean, I think sadly in my case, my main kind of advocate, who's now one of the main leaders at CBC, has really watched me fall apart and get PTSD and be completely freaking traumatized and be completely burnt out, and has said that too, like, I'm so sorry that change has come at your expense, and just fighting so hard, and not having the resources, not having the time, and I don't want anyone to do that. And that's why, we were talking earlier about us being light-skinned and having privilege and being able to be in certain spaces And most of my friends are not going to be doing that because they know they're going to experience way more racism and way more pushback and not be taken as seriously as a person who was white privileged. And so for me, I'm just like, I'm in this position right now and I need to be able to use that privilege to support other people coming through. And there's a lot of work to do. I think settlers white people need to use their voice and need to use their power a lot more than they are. And there's so much of that happening here in particular and in my newsroom, but how do you word things? I mean, I always ask, I was telling my students today, sometimes you just have to break the rules in order to see change. Like, breaking a rule would be telling somebody I'm interviewing, like, you have full control in this interview. If you want to end it, you can. That's like a huge no-no. Being more collaborative, that's a huge no-no. I think asking, pushing, using your voice, speaking out. Often in newsrooms, you're in meetings, story meetings with all white people or no Native people, no Indigenous people, and you're the lone voice. And I remember somebody being in a meeting and people go, "Oh, carding doesn't happen here in Vancouver." Like carding where people are being racially profiled. And me and this South Asian woman looking at each other like, and being like so small at that table, like we weren't leaders, and being like, actually it does, but feeling like then you're a troublemaker, right? Like, I've been carded, so now I'm like the bad person. And so being able to go on Twitter and be like, do you think carding happens here? Oh yeah, I've been carded. And so that's the power of social media for me, is being able to be surrounded by community and people who relate and people who can hold that power and that space together in spaces where you're the outsider traditionally, like in a newsroom.
Yeah, about collaboration, like I think about that a lot, like even just like in my own work and like seeing, like I would like to see like more co-authoring, co-teaching, together, like people working together, and then like Indigenous people that, they might not be a journalist, but they want to tell stories, but they don't want that daily grind of like, so how can newsrooms work with that person to still like tell those stories that they have that in with, but in a way where they are paid equitably, where they're able to contribute and those kinds of things. And I just also really felt deeply the troublemaker. I just always feel like the squeaky wheel of like, well, actually, like, and it's just like.
But not everybody feels comfortable doing that, right?
No.
And so when you do, I feel like you just have to learn how to be diplomatic, but push that boundary as much as you can.
It really is wordsmithing, really. And I personally like to leverage like things like UNDRIP, TRC, Western Strategic Plan, Indigenous History. I'm like, the policy says, which sounds like such a colonial thing, but it's like, all right, well, you guys, that's how you like things. Well, here's the policies. Here are the things that say you got to be accountable and you got to do this because
this is your obligation.
That's true.
So, yeah, exactly.
So yeah. Okay. Jeremy asked a question. And I guess this like ties in with another. Well, okay, wait. I'll ask this one first. What does journalistic integrity look like in a decolonized newsroom?
Oh man,
it's a tough one.
I don't know. I feel like if we're going to be talking about what does a decolonized newsroom look like, we're not going to be speaking English, right? Like when we're talking about, I mean, you can be decolonizing, but is there such thing as a decolonial? Like, are we all, like, that means we're going to be able to fully be ourselves on air, wearing our regalia. Like, not everybody has regalia or, wants to do that, but what does that look like? It means supporting Indigenous people to be speaking their own languages, like we do up north at CBC. We broadcast in 9 different Indigenous languages. Like, that's signing off. Angela Sterritt, CBC News Vancouver. No, it'd be Angela Sterritt, CBC News Kem Kemalai, Angela Sterritt, CBC News Laklukai. And I can do some of that, but that's felt very new. Like, if I did that before, that would feel very like, what the frick are you? You can't do that. I'd get pushback from camera, I'd get pushback from producers. They might not, so journalistic integrity in terms of a decolonial newsroom, I think, would be drastic. And I think one of the huge problems with Canadian society is just how much colonization is just enshrined literally in law. Like literally the Delgamuukw said that we were allowed to use our culture and our identity as part of the argument, like our own laws, right? And that was like 1997. Like, like it's just ridiculous. So a decolonial newsroom, I mean, that's what I think about. I think about like, if you want to decolonize, then we shouldn't be speaking English. First of all, like you should be giving me resources to learn Gitxsan in all of our workplaces, right? People should be not questioned for wearing a medicine bag at work. People should be allowed to wear their full regalia. People should be allowed to talk about the territories that we're on that aren't colonial. Like I think it's like very drastically different. And so I think for me, the way to have a measure of where we are is languages, right? Like that's the essence of who we are. And so I think we're like there. Like here's decolonization and we're over here, you know, like we're not even close. I think like there's little incremental changes that we're making to decolonize, but it's just so far off right now. Like it's hard to even imagine.
I don't even know that we can, because like it's such a process that it's like what the outcome, I hope it's better than what I could even imagine is a fully decolonized anything. But in terms of like integrity, I'm just thinking about like how even just like from like Joanne Archibald's like Indigenous story work, like where she works with like elders to sort of like distill like storytelling as pedagogy, like as teaching, but like also talks about like these principles and I just feel like those principles like respect, like reciprocity, relevance, that those are things of integrity, and that like Indigenous storytellers are like living that because that's like our teachings in various different ways. And so it's like, I don't think journalistic integrity is compromised by Indigenous people, Indigenous storytelling, Indigenous people being careful and mindful of others' trauma, of others' experience. Like, I really feel like the integrity of journalism will be strengthened because there is this commitment to truth and commitment, and there's teachings about recognizing that there are multiple truths and that two things can be true at once, and many people can see the world in different ways, and that's where journalism, like, it's like seeing so many different views, conflicting views, yes, but not like conflicting in a non-generative way, like in a generative way that brings us all closer to the solutions that we need for a world that is in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like worldviews, like accepting Indigenous worldviews. Like no one's ever asked me, like, you know, or just like reflecting, like how have we done wrong? You know, I just don't hear that.
So Jeremy is like, Sara Mai is one of our grads. Yes, I am. I'm very proud to be. But each year, our MJC grad program, we have maybe one or two Indigenous students. What can their classmates and other young journalists do to help disrupt colonial narratives in newsrooms? So I guess like for students, like maybe any advice that you have?
Man, that's really hard because I just remember being a young journalist. Like I didn't go to journalism school, but I was a journalist like as a teen. And I just remember just being so like, you just do what you're told. You know, you got to get through, like you need to get to the next level. So I think that's really hard. And I think it's easy. Like journalists are so disposable these days, right? Like there's just a huge dearth of jobs out there. So I feel like telling a young student to go in there and disrupt Colonial, I mean, it scares me. Like if you want them to get jobs, like I don't know if it's a good idea to be like poking the bear right out of the gate. You know what I mean? I mean, I think it's good to educate yourself and have that understanding and be able to share that where it's safe. But I find in a lot of spaces, it's just not, you know? I think one of the most important things for my career was finding allies immediately and being like, and just knowing like, okay, this person is gonna totally have my back and this person is not. and just knowing how to navigate those situations. And knowing how to do a better way. Like I think Amelia, one of my students is going to Yellowknife and having, I think, some knowledge about what extractive journalism is and what parachute journalism is and what solutions journalism is, and how to be kind and professional at the same time and compassionate. I think that's going to give her tools to do incredible journalism that goes beyond, just the nuts and bolts of like a great basic story, but to do an incredible story that will get not just eyes on it, but have real impact. And I think that's the best thing you can do, is to go at an Indigenous story with understanding that this is complicated, but you can do this. You can be an investigative journalist. And that's something that I find there's a huge lack of, is people who are focused on investigative journalism when it comes to Indigenous stories. But I think that's the approach you need. You need to go at it like an investigative reporter rather than just like a daily news thing. So that's the best advice I can give. Go with the story like this is the most important story you're telling in your life, and uphold it. And anytime I've been like, I want to get an award for the story, it's not props for me, it's props for those Indigenous stories, so that other journalists can tell those stories and be like, yeah, this is an important story, it's going to win awards. And yeah, do the best job you can on Indigenous stories, and hold it like it's the most important thing you've done. That we don't have enough of that out there.
Not give up either,
and not give up, because it's hard.
It is really hard, and I know some of the graduates that are struggling in newsrooms right now to try to do the right thing, and that don't give up, keep doing it.
Yeah.
The other question is just, I'm not entirely sure if it was even recorded. So that question, could someone in the audience maybe answer this person about whether the link will be posted afterwards? But other than that, there are no questions showing up on my screen here. And so is there anything that people can do today when they, right this moment after this talk? Any things that you're like, calls to action that you have?
I mean, just take the time to educate yourself, right? And force yourself to think outside of seeing Indigenous people as a stereotype. And we can talk all day long about how we don't, but we do. We all do. It's super ingrained. It's enshrined in law. It's ingrained in everything we do. Force yourself to educate yourself on one thing even. Focus on the 60 Scoop. Focus on residential school. Focus on an incredible Indigenous community who's doing amazing, wonderful things. Focus on the joy. Allow space for Indigenous people to not just, be tropes or be oppressed. Make space. Make space for Indigenous people. That's what I would say. Make space for all the good.
Totally.
And don't just call us resilient, because that's annoying.
Yeah. I think my one thing, and I think I told the MMJC grad students, I'm like, normalize putting what treaty territory in the like if you're saying like Edmonton, put treaty, is it 6 or 9? I'm failing myself here. But like I would really love to see more recognition of like Indigenous place names and treaties in news coverage. So that's my big ask of folks. So even though I just blundered my way through using an example of a treaty area I'm clearly not familiar with. But,
but also BC has no treaty. Well, like no historical
But
treaties.
they could say like,
unceded,
or just
territory.
whatever territory they're at,
exactly,
or the Indigenous place name. Yeah, that would be great. But yeah,
I love that. It's been great chatting with you.
You too. Chimi Gwech, this was really nice. I was looking forward
for
to
having
this.
me, and for everyone here. This is the first public event I've done since 2 years.
Yeah,
since 2 years.
Yeah. Oh my God. And now it's over. Sad. Yeah, awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's it, folks. Thanks for coming.